The plane touched down just after noon, and the heat hit Daniel Whitcomb the moment the cabin door opened. Thick, salt-heavy, nothing like the dry Ohio August he'd left behind. "First time seeing it from this side of the world?" Renata Coleman asked, sliding her sunglasses down from her hair. "First time seeing it at all," Daniel said. 26 years married, and I've never left the country without kids fighting in the back seat." She laughed. A real laugh, not the boardroom kind. "Well, no kids fighting today." The resort was the kind of place Daniel had only seen in the in-flight magazine. Overwater bungalows strung along a turquoise lagoon. Staff who seemed to appear before you'd finished forming the thought that you needed something. He and Renata had worked together 8 years. Conferences, quarterly reviews, the occasional dinner with clients where the conversation stayed exactly where it belonged. This felt different, though he couldn't yet say why. Maybe it was just the water. Maybe it was something else. They spent the afternoon in meetings with the resort's ownership group, Renata sharp and unhurried, closing gaps in the contract language before Daniel had even spotted them. He watched her work and felt something he hadn't expected. Not attraction, not yet. Admiration. And underneath the admiration, a small, uncomfortable awareness of how long it had been since he'd watched Carol do anything with that kind of focus. He pushed the thought down. Dinner was on a private deck built out over the water, torches lit along the railing, the sky doing something orange and pink that didn't look real. Renata ordered wine for both of them without asking, then caught herself. "Sorry, old habit. Should have asked what you wanted." "It's fine," Daniel said. "You usually order better than I would anyway." They talked business for the first 20 minutes, the deal points, the partnership terms. Then, somewhere between the second course and the third, the conversation drifted somewhere neither of them had steered it. "Can I ask you something?" Renata said, turning her glass slowly by the stem. "Sure. Is everything all right at home, Daniel?" He looked up. "You've seemed somewhere else lately," she said. "Not just today. The last few weeks. I figured it wasn't my business, but we're 11 time zones from Ohio and there's nobody here to overhear. So." He opened his mouth to give her the easy answer. "Fine, just busy. You know how it is." The one he'd given 3 other people that same month. Instead, he found himself saying nothing at all. The torches cracked softly in the wind. Renata didn't fill the silence. She just watched him, waiting, like she already knew the easy answer wasn't coming. "It's complicated," Daniel finally said. "Most true things are." Renata set her glass down. "You don't have to tell me anything, Daniel. I've known you 8 years. I've never seen you look like you did on that flight. Somewhere else. Like you were bracing for something." He turned his own glass in his hand, watching the wine catch the torchlight. He hadn't planned to say it. He hadn't said it to anyone. Not his brother. Not his closest friend from the plant. But something about the water, the distance, the fact that in 6 days he'd be back in his own kitchen with his own silences, loosened something in his chest. "Carol wants to open our marriage," he said. He watched it land. Renata's face didn't do what he expected. No widened eyes, no careful arrangement into diplomacy. Just a small, quiet stillness, like she was recalculating something. "Okay," she said. "That's it? Okay? What did you want me to say?" "I don't know. Something. Anything other than okay." Renata leaned back in her chair, looking out at the dark water instead of at him. "My marriage ended for almost the same reason, Daniel. Not that David never asked for anything like that, but we drifted so far apart that by the time either of us noticed, There wasn't a marriage left to open or close. Just two people living efficiently in the same house. She looked back at him. So no, I'm not shocked. I recognize it. 26 years, Daniel said, mostly to himself. The kids left, and it was like Carol looked at me one day and realized she didn't know who was sitting across from her anymore. And I think she's right. I think I stopped knowing who I was, too. Do you want it? Renata asked. The arrangement. Is it something you want, or something you agreed to because saying no felt like giving up? The question sat there, uncomfortably precise. I don't know yet, Daniel admitted. I said yes because I didn't want to lose her over saying no. I never expected to. He stopped himself. To what? Nothing. It's late. We should probably call it a night before I say something I'll regret in the morning. Renata studied him a moment longer, then nodded and rose from the table. You're right. Big day tomorrow. We're meeting the ownership group at 9. She walked him back along the wooden path toward the bungalows, the lagoon black and glassy on either side, lit only by the small lanterns staked into the walkway. At his door, she stopped. She didn't say goodnight right away. She stood there, one hand resting lightly on the doorframe, close enough that Daniel could smell the faint trace of her perfume under the salt air. For what it's worth, she said quietly, I don't think wanting to be seen again makes you a bad husband, Daniel. I think it makes you human. She should have turned and walked back toward her own bungalow then. That was how this was supposed to end. A kind word, a closed door, morning meetings. Instead, she stayed exactly where she was, her hand still on the frame, watching him with an expression he didn't have a name for. Neither of them moved. The lanterns hissed faintly along the walkway. Somewhere out past the reef, a wave broke and pulled back, patient as breathing. Renata, Daniel said, and he didn't know himself what was supposed to come after her name. You don't have to say anything, she said. I should go. She didn't go. He should have stepped back into his room and shut the door. That was the version of tonight that made sense, the version Carol would understand, even with the door they'd opened between them. But standing there, watching Renata not leave, he understood that some doors weren't the kind you walked through on purpose. Some doors you found yourself already standing inside of, wondering how you'd gotten there. The meetings finished early the next afternoon. Contracts signed, hands shaken, the ownership group satisfied. Renata suggested they take the evening for themselves before the flight home. We earned it, she said, and Daniel didn't argue. They walked the beach as the sun dropped low, sand still warm underfoot, the tide pulling soft lines around their ankles. Neither of them talked much. Words felt like they might tip something over. At one point, her hand brushed his. An accident, maybe, or maybe not quite. And neither of them pulled away. They kept walking, her hand near his, not quite touching, then simply there. And Daniel felt 20 years fall off some part of himself he'd forgotten he was carrying. Dinner was quiet, unhurried. Renata told him about David, about the slow years before the divorce. Daniel told her things about Carol he'd never said out loud. Not complaints, just facts. The small distances that had opened up one ordinary day at a time until neither of them noticed how far apart they'd drifted. Afterward, they walked back along the same wooden path as the night before. This time, at his door, neither of them pretended it might end differently. I keep telling myself to stop, Renata said, her voice low. So do I. And I don't want to. She looked at him for a long moment, really looked, the way no one had looked at him in longer than he wanted to admit. Her hand came up slowly, hovering near his jaw, giving him every chance to step back. He didn't. The kiss, when it came, was brief. A breath caught and held, the world narrowing to the warmth of her hand against his face, the salt air, the quiet certainty of a line being crossed. Then it was over, and they were simply standing there in the dark, foreheads nearly touching, both of them breathing like they'd been running. Daniel stepped back first. "I need to think," he said, his voice unsteady. Renata, I need to think." She nodded, her own composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "Okay," she said softly. "Think." She turned and walked back down the wooden path, and Daniel stood alone at his door, with his heart going hard against his ribs. 26 years of marriage, and one kiss standing on opposite sides of a scale he didn't yet know how to balance. Daniel didn't sleep. He lay in the dark listening to the water lap against the pilings beneath the bungalow, running the kiss back over and over like a scene from someone else's life. 26 years, and he'd never once come close to this. Not close enough to matter. And now, 11 time zones from home, he had crossed a line he'd never even seen coming toward him. By morning, he had a headache and no clarity at all. Renata found him on the private deck before breakfast, 2 cups of coffee in hand. She set one in front of him and sat down across the small table, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. "I'm not going to pretend last night didn't happen," she said finally. "I don't do that. But I also know you didn't sleep, and I know what that means. What does it mean? It means some part of you is already deciding against it." Daniel wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, more for something to hold than for warmth. "Carol and I opened the marriage so we wouldn't lose each other. That was the whole point. Not to replace what we had, just to breathe. But last night didn't feel like breathing, Renata. It felt like something else. Something bigger than the arrangement was built to hold. You're saying it wasn't just physical. I'm saying if it were just physical, I think I'd already know what to do." He looked at her. "This isn't a business trip anymore, is it? For either of us." Renata's jaw tightened, just slightly. "No, it isn't." "Then I have to be honest about what that means. If I go further with this, with you, I'm not living inside the rules Carol and I agreed to. I'm stepping outside them. That's not opening a marriage. That's leaving one. And if that's what you want, I don't know if it is. That's the problem. 12 hours ago, I thought I did." Renata was quiet for a long moment, turning her cup slowly on the table. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its edge, gone something closer to tired and honest. "I liked who I was with you this week, Daniel. I haven't liked myself in a long time, but I've also already lost one marriage to a slow drift. Nobody stopped in time, and I'm not interested in being the reason somebody else loses theirs. Whatever you decide, decide it because it's true, not because of a kiss on a beach in the Maldives." They sat with that a while, the lagoon turning gold as the sun climbed. That evening, their last before the flight home, Daniel walked out to the end of the resort's long wooden dock alone. The water was calm, the sky streaked with the last color of the day. He thought about Carol at the kitchen table 26 years ago, laughing at something he'd long since forgotten. He thought about the quiet distance that had grown between them, season after season. Neither of them cruel, just tired, just human. He thought about Renata's hand hovering near his face, giving him every chance to step back, and how, for one night, he hadn't wanted to. He understood, standing there, that wanting hadn't been the question. The question was what he was willing to build, and with whom. When Renata found him at the end of the dock, he already had his answer. "I'm going home to fight for my marriage," he said quietly. "Not because what happened here didn't matter. It did. It mattered more than I want to admit, but it showed me something I'd stopped looking for. And I don't think the answer is you. I think the answer is finding that same thing again, with Carol, if she'll still have me." Renata nodded slowly, something like relief and something like sadness moving across her face in the same breath. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think that's the right answer. I just wish it hadn't taken almost losing your footing to see it." "So do I." They flew home the next day as colleagues again. Polite, professional, the 8 years of history intact beneath 1 week that would never be spoken of again. But Daniel knew, watching the ocean give way to clouds beneath the wing, that he wasn't flying home the same man who'd left. Carol was in the kitchen when he got home, exactly where she'd been 1,000 evenings before, chopping vegetables at the counter, the radio low, the house smelling like garlic, and the particular quiet of 2 people who'd stopped reaching for each other years ago. "How was the Maldives?" she asked, not looking up. "Carol," Daniel said, "can we talk? Really talk? Not the kind where I say fine, and you say good, and we both go back to whatever we were doing." She set the knife down. Something in his voice must have told her this wasn't the ordinary kind of conversation, because she pulled out a chair and sat, giving him her full attention for the first time in longer than either of them would have admitted. He told her most of it. Not every detail. Some things belonged only to him, a private reckoning he'd have to carry alone. But he told her about the distance he'd felt closing in on someone else this week, and how it had frightened him more than tempted him in the end. He told her that somewhere over the Pacific, watching the ocean disappear beneath the clouds, he'd understood that the open marriage hadn't been the problem or the solution. It had just been a door they'd built, because neither of them knew how to say the harder thing. "I miss you. I miss us. I don't know how we got so far apart." Carol listened without interrupting, her hands folded on the table, her eyes wet by the time he finished. "I didn't ask to open the marriage because I wanted someone else," she said quietly. "I asked because I didn't know how else to get your attention back. I didn't think it would work like that. I don't think I thought it through at all." "Neither did I," Daniel admitted. "But I think I needed to almost lose my footing to understand what I was standing on. 26 years, Carol. I don't want to spend the next 26 drifting further away because neither of us knew how to say we were scared." She reached across the table and took his hand. Not a grand gesture, just her fingers closing around his the way they used to, back when that alone had been enough to steady him. "Then let's close the door we opened," she said, "and find our way back to each other instead. The real way. The hard way." "The hard way," Daniel agreed. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, the word didn't frighten him. Some marriages are lost in the leaving. Others are saved not by the mistake avoided, but by the honest conversation that finally comes after. The one that should have happened years before either of them ever needed a door to walk through.